Welcome back to the Versatile PC channel. As you read from the title and you see a bunch of GPUs here on the table, that means one thing. We ran a bunch of benchmarks. I know it's a few months later into the generation launch, but that means that the prices have settled significantly for some of these cards on the table. With the Intel Arc series, the cards have come down closer to MSRP at multiple retailers. When it comes to the Radeon GPUs, the 9060 XT 8GB is kind of the only one card that is below MSRP. The rest of them are still way above MSRP. And on the Nvidia side, we used in this video, we focus on the 5060. Again, it is something that's close to MSRP. Sometimes you can find deals a little bit lower than MSRP. Sometimes they're a little over MSRP, but they're pretty regularly close to MSRP. Other cards we have here that we benchmarked today for some used options as well. A card that is hard to ignore is the RTX 3070. I know it is technically 2 generations old at this point. However, on the used market, it is roughly around $200 US when you buy it on eBay, Facebook Marketplace, or any other used sites you can buy from. For our base card, we used the RTX 2080 Super. See how all these cards compared to a few generation old cards. So if you were on older hardware, maybe you are considering a GPU upgrade. Now that the prices have started to fall and gotten to a price that's reasonable to a degree, that means maybe you will see one of these cards and you've been looking at it. So let's go ahead and jump into our benchmark data. As always, all of our benchmark data is captured at 3 different resolutions. We use 1080p, high settings in all the titles we use. In 1440p, we use high settings, and in 4K, we use also high settings. No ray tracing, no upscaling, no frame generation. We will be doing deeper dives into any of the new generation cards in the future when it comes to the frame time pacing, ray tracing performance, upscaling performance. Right now, we just want to see how they compare apples to apples in multiple different titles. Blacksmith Wukong built-in benchmark at 1080p. You see RTX 2080 Super performs at 91 average FPS. Performs really well in this title. The B570 from Intel does an average of 64 FPS. The Intel Arc B580 does an average of 70 FPS. The RTX 5060 does an average of 127 FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB does an average of 140 FPS. The RTX 3070 does an average of 108 FPS, meaning that the B570 is almost 35% slower than the 2080 Super. The B580 is 26% slower than the 2080 Super. RTX 5060 is 33% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The 9060 XT 16GB is 42% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The RTX 3070 is 17% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. Blacksmith Wukong at 1440p. The 2080 Super does an average of 80 FPS. The B570 does an average of 57 FPS. The B580 does an average of 62 FPS. The RTX 5060 does an average of 109 FPS. The 9060 XT does 124 average FPS. The RTX 3070 does an average of 97 FPS. The 2080 Super compared to the B570, the 2080 Super comes out 33% faster. The B580 compared to the 2080 Super, the 2080 Super is 25% faster. RTX 5060 is about 30% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The 9060 XT 16GB is about 43% faster in this test. At 1440p, the RTX 3070 is about 19% faster than 2080 Super. Moving on to Blacksmith Wukong built-in benchmark at 4K, everything high settings. The 2080 Super does an average of 63 FPS. The B570 does an average of 47 FPS. The Intel Arc B580 does an average of 53 FPS. The RTX 5060 does an average of 87 FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB does an average of 97 FPS. The RTX 3070 does an average of 79 FPS. The 2080 Super is about 29% faster than the B570 in this test. B580 is about 17% slower than the 2080 Super in this test. The RTX 5060 is about 32% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The 9060 XT 16GB is about 42.5% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is about 22.5% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to Marvel Rivals at 1080p, using the built-in benchmark, everything on high settings, no upscaling, no upscaling, no frame generation, just raw rasterization performance. The 2080 Super is able to do 80 average FPS. The B570 is able to do 76 average FPS. The B580 is able to do 86 average FPS. RTX 5060 is able to do 115 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB is able to do 123 average FPS. RTX 3070 is able to do 116 average FPS, meaning that the B570 is only 5% slower than the 2080 Super in this test. The B580 is 7% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The RTX 5060 is about 35% faster in this test. The 9060 XT is 42% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The RTX 3070 is about 36% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. Moving on to our rivals at 1440p, the 2080 Super is able to do 61 average FPS. The B570 is able to do 56 average FPS. The Intel Arc B580 is able to do 62 average FPS. The RTX 5060 is able to do 81 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB is able to do 89 average FPS. The RTX 3070 is able to do 86 average FPS, meaning that the RTX 2080 Super is about 8.5% faster than the B570 in this test. Intel Arc B580 is about 1.6% faster than the 2080 Super, so basically within a frame of each other, they're pretty much identical performance at 1440p. The RTX 5060 is about 28% faster than the 2080 Super. 9060 XT is about 37% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is about 34% faster than the 2080 Super, meaning that the 9060 XT 16GB is only about 3% faster than the 3070 in this test. Moving on to Marvel Rivals at 4K. The 2080 Super is able to do 33 average FPS. The B570 is able to do 33 average FPS. The Intel Arc B580 is able to do 37 average FPS. The RTX 5060 is able to do 47 average FPS. The 9060 XT is able to do 49 average FPS. The RTX 3070 is able to do 50 average FPS. Again, at 4K in Marvel Rivals, none of these cards at high settings are very playable. So at 4K in Marvel Rivals, that means the 2080 Super and the B570 are pretty much identical performance. The B580 comes out 11% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The RTX 5060 comes out 35% faster than the 2080 Super. The 9060 XT comes out 39% faster. And the RTX 3070 does the best in this title at 41% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to a plate to record at 1080p. The 2080 Super is able to do 56 average FPS. As the Intel Arc B570 is able to do 48.8 average FPS. The Sparkle Titan B580 is able to do 55.5 average FPS. The RTX 5060 is able to do 73.1 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB is able to do 79.2 average FPS. The RTX 3070 is able to do 73.2 average FPS. That means the 2080 Super is about 13.7% faster than the B570. The Intel Arc B580 is about 0.1. The Intel Arc B580 is about 0.9% fast. That means Intel Arc B580 is about 1% slower here than the 2080 Super, which is a margin of error, so pretty much identical performance. The RTX 5060 is about 26.5% faster than the 2080 Super. The 9060 XT 16GB is about 34.3% faster. The RTX the RTX 3070 performs pretty much like the 5060 in this test, which means it is also 26% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to plate to Requiem at 1440p. The 2080 Super is able to do 51.5 average FPS. The B570 is able to do 33.4 average FPS. The B580 is able to do 44.2 average FPS. The RTX 5060 is able to do 52.4 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB is able to do 55.4 average FPS. The RTX 3070 is able to do 54.4 average FPS, meaning that the 2080 Super is 42% faster than the B570 at 1440p. The Intel Arc B580 seems to struggle at 1440p for some reason in this test, so it just dropped significantly. So now it is 15% slower than the 2080 Super. The RTX 5060 performs pretty similar to the 2080 Super, being only 1.9% faster, almost 2% faster. The 9060 XT 16GB is about 7% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is about 5.7% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is 5.7% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. Moving on to a plate to recommend 4K. None of these GPUs offer really good performance at this test. Basically everything is sub 40 FPS. Most things are, in the 30 FPS range. So let's go through them real quick. 2080 Super does 21.5 average FPS. The B570 does 23.4 average FPS. And Intel Arc B580 does 38.7 average FPS. The RTX 5060 does an average of 35.8 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB does 31 average FPS. The RTX 3070 does 33.2 average FPS. For some reason, the Intel Arc really comes out ahead in this at this title at 4K. Not quite sure why. I mean, none of them offer really good performance. A lot of them offering stuttering issues, suboptimal performance. So it could just be the way that in that benchmark pass. Go ahead and go to Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion Remastered. Also, a title that wasn't known to be super easy to run, a very demanding title. It does see, especially in higher resolutions, it does run over the 8GB VRAM buffer, as we'll see later in the test. As we see later in the benchmarks, most of these cards offer okay performance except the Intel cards. They're all above 60 FPS, some of them barely, some of them significantly. So let's go through them real quick. 2080 Super averages 67.7 average FPS. The Intel Arc B570 does 36.9 average FPS. The Intel Arc B580 does 49.7 average FPS. RTX 5060 does 74.2 average FPS. The 9060 XT 60GB does 88.2 average FPS. The RTX 3070 does an average of 61.6 average FPS. 2080 Super is almost 60% faster than the B570 in this test. B580 is 30% slower than the 2080 Super. The RTX 5060 is about 9% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is 9% slower than the 2080 Super in this test for some reason. Moving on to Oblivion Remastered at 1440p. It does seem to definitely make it more realistic here. I don't know what happened with 1080p. Oblivion Remastered. Again, this game does have some weird optimization or some weird coding issues. So Oblivion Remastered at 1440p. This seems to be more in line with other results we've seen. 2080 Super does 33.2 average FPS. The B570 does 21.9 average FPS. The B580 does 40.5 average FPS. The RTX 5060 does 52.1 average FPS. The 9060 XT 16GB does 58.4 average FPS. The RTX 3070 does 45.9 average FPS. I mean that the 2080 Super is about 41% faster than the B570. The B580 comes out almost 20% ahead of the 2080 Super. The RTX 5060 comes out 44% faster than the 2080 Super. The 9060 XT comes out 55% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 comes out 32% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to Oblivion Remastered at 4K. All of these GPUs offer really bad performance, with the 2080 Super basically stuttering, becoming a stuttering nightmare. All of the 8GB cards in this test become stuttering nightmares. Even the 10GB B570 really struggles in this test. Not that the B580 or the 9060 XT offer great performance, but they don't have as much weird stuttering issues as the 8GB cards and even the 10GB cards. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5. Built in benchmark at 1080p. 2080 Super does an average of 123 FPS. The B570 does an average of 128 FPS. B580 does an average of 141 FPS. RTX 5060 does an average of 193 FPS. 9060 XT 60GB does an average of 237 FPS. RTX 3070 does an average of 157 FPS. The B570 comes out about 4% faster than the 2080 Super in this test. The B580 comes out 13.6% faster than the 2080 Super, so about 10% faster than the B570. RTX 5060 comes out 44.3% faster than the 2080 Super. 9060 XT 16GB comes out 63.3% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 comes out almost 25% faster than the 2080 Super. Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p, built-in benchmark. 2080 Super does an average of 102 FPS. Intel Arc B570 does an average of 109 FPS. The Intel Arc B580 does an average of 116 FPS. RTX 5060 does an average of 157 FPS. 9060 XT does an average of 197 FPS. RTX 3070 does an average of 134 FPS. 2080 Super is about 7% slower than the B570 in this test. The B580 is about 12.8% faster than the 2080 Super. RTX 5060 is about 42.5% faster than the 2080 Super. 9060 XT 16GB is about 63.5% faster than the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 is about 27% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5 at 4K. This is one of the only titles on these in our benchmark charts that does offer good performance at 4K for these more entry-level cards. 2080 Super averages 71 FPS. The B570 averages 75 FPS. The Intel Arc B580 offers 83 average FPS. RTX 5060 averages 102 FPS. 9060 XT 16GB averages 127 FPS. RTX 3070 averages 97 FPS. 2080 Super comes out 5.5% slower than the B570. The B580 is about 10% faster than the B570 in this test. The RTX 5060 is about 20% faster than the B580 in this test. The 9060 XT is about 56.6% faster than the 2080 Super. RTX 3070 is about 4% slower than the RTX 5060 in this test. Moving on to Black Ops 6 built-in benchmark at 1080p high settings. The 2080 Super is the only card on here sub 60 FPS at 57 average FPS. The P570 does an average of 64 FPS. Our Intel Arc B580 does an average of 72 FPS. RTX 5060 does an average of 89 FPS. 9060 XT 16GB does an average of 123 FPS. RTX 3070 does an average of 86 FPS, meaning that the B570 is about 11.6% faster than the 2080 Super. The Intel Arc B580 is about 12% faster than the B570 in this test. RTX 5060 is about 43.8% faster than the 2080 Super. 9060 XT 16GB is about 73% faster than the 2080 Super. RTX 3070 is about 40.6% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to Black Ops 6 at 1440p. 2080 Super is able to average 39 FPS. Intel Arc B570 is able to average 44 FPS. The Intel Arc B580 is able to average 49 FPS. The RTX 5060 is able to average 61 FPS. 9060 XT 16GB is able to average 84 FPS. RTX 3070 is able to average 61 FPS, meaning that the B570 comes out 12% faster than the 2080 Super. The B580 is about 22.7% faster than the 2080 Super. RTX 5060 is about 44% faster than the 2080 Super. 9060 XT is about 73.2% faster than the 2080 Super. RTX 3070 is about 44% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to Black Ops 6 at 4K. The B580, the 2080 Super averages 23 FPS. The B570 averages 25 FPS. The B580 averages 28 FPS. The RTX 5060 averages 33 FPS. 9060 XT 16GB averages 45 FPS. RTX 3070 averages 36 FPS. None of these cards offering really playable performance at 4K. Moving on to our averages here. Across the 6 games tested at 1080p, the 2080 Super is able to average 79.1 average FPS, meaning it's 12% faster than the Intel Arc B570. The Intel Arc B580 and the 2080 Super offer pretty much identical performance at this tier. The 5060 is about 34% faster than the 2080 Super, which means it's about 34% faster than the Intel Arc B580 in our testing. 9060 XT 16GB is about 52% faster than the 2080 Super across the 6 titles, across the 6 games tested. RTX 5060, RTX 3070 is about 23.6% faster than 2080 Super in our testing. Moving on to 1440p, the RTX 5070, the RTX B570 is 20.6% slower than the 2080 Super. The B580 and the 2080 Super pretty much identical performance. RTX 5060 is about 26% faster at 1440p. 9060 XT is still around 50% faster than the 2080 Super at 1440p. This RTX 3070 and the RTX 5060 really start matching performance here, being both 26% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to 4K, across the 6 games tested, the B570 and the 2080 Super pretty much perform identical. The Intel Arc B580 does seem to perform a lot better at 4K than the 2080 Super, being 16% faster. RTX 5060 is about 35% faster than the 2080 Super at 4K. The 9060 XT seems to be still in the 50% range over the 2080 Super across the board. RTX 3070 performs about 34% faster, pretty much on par with the 5060. On the overall average across all games tested, across all resolutions, the 2080 Super does 59.1 average FPS. The Intel Arc B570 does 52.1 average FPS. The Intel Arc B580 does an average of 61.7 FPS. The RTX 5060 does about 85 average FPS. 9060 XT 16GB does 99.8 average FPS. RTX 3070 does about 27. RTX 3070 does about 27%. Damn it, I keep fucking that up. RTX 3070 does about 77.6 average FPS, meaning that the 2080 Super is about 12.6% faster across all resolutions and all games tested than the B570. The B580 comes out 4% ahead of the 2080 Super. The RTX 5060 comes out 35% faster than the 2080 Super. The 9060 XT still keeps its 50% lead over the 2080 Super. The RTX 3070 comes out 27% faster than the 2080 Super. Moving on to cost per frame, which is down below here. So if you take the MSRP of the 2080 Super, if you take if you take the MSRP of the 2080 Super, which is almost $700 at the time from the information I could find, it would cost $8.84 a frame at 1080p. At 1440p, it would cost $11.44 a frame. At 4K, it would cost $18.84 per frame. The B570 at its MSRP of $220 would cost $3.16 a frame. At 1440p, it would cost $4.43 a frame. At 4K, it would almost cost $6 a frame. The V580 at 1080p is basically the same price, is the same cost per frame as the 5070 in this test. Damn, I fucked it up. The Intel Arc B580 is pretty much identical to the B570 and cost per frame at 1080p. At 1440p, it does seem to be a little bit cheaper per frame, and then at 4K, it also is a little bit cheaper per frame. The 5060 seems to be the better value product at 1080p in these tests, being at $2.68 a frame at MSRP. The 1440p, it's still one of the cheaper cost per frames, and at 4K, it's still one of the cheaper cost per frames. 9060 XT is the 9060 XT 16GB at $350 US is the cheapest cost per frame across all games tested across all the resolutions. RTX 3070 at launch price at $500 US would cost $5 per frame at 1080p, $6.30 at 1440p, and almost $10 a frame at 4K. But moving on to actual pricing, what we could find on retailers in the US using Newegg, Amazon, PC Parts Picker, stuff like that. Parts we could actually find in stock. The used market, the 2080 Super seems to hover around the $200 US mark. So that would cost $2.53 a frame at 1080p, $3.27 a frame at 1440p, and at 4K it would still be about $5.40 a frame. The B570 is still a little bit over its MSRP at $240 US, meaning the cost per frame jumps up quite a bit here, being that it's almost $3.50 per frame, almost $5 per frame at 1440p, and over $6 a frame at 4K. The B580 is also still over its MSRP by about $10 to $20, depending on the model you look at, which means it is still, it's almost $3.30 a frame at 1080p. At 1440p, it's almost $4.20 a frame, and at 4K, it's almost $6 a frame. Looking at the RTX 5060, it is one of the only cards on this list that is actually still at its MSRP regularly. So basically the cost per frame stays the same across the board. 9060 XT 16GB does seem to be holding a price premium of about $30 in the US market. So it does jump the cost per frame up to $2.80 per frame at 1080p. At 1440p, it matches the 5060 it matches the RTX 5060 in cost per frame, and at 4K it becomes more expensive than the and at 4K it becomes more expensive than the 5060 cost per frame. One of the better value products on this list, because now that the RTX 3070 is a few generations old on the used market, if you want to take that gamble on it being a good part or bad part, it is about $230 US. From what I found, $200 or $220 on eBay, maybe $230 for some of the other models, meaning that it is one of the better cost per frames on the used market at $2.19 a frame at 1080p. 1440p it is about $2.76 a frame, and at 4K it is the cheapest on the list by almost $1 at $4.17 a frame. So there you have it. The RTX 3070 on the used market definitely seems to be one of the better value products currently in the market. The RTX 5060, can't believe I'm going to say this, but seems to be one of the better values in terms of new graphics cards. Again, the 8GB VRAM buffer does pose some current issues and will continue to pose more issues in the future. Radeon is really struggling this generation to keep their recommendable graphics cards at a competitive price. The 9070 XT is seeing itself being over $200 more than its MSRP. The 9070 is over $50 more than its MSRP. The 9060 XT 16GB it's $20 over its MSRP, making it almost $100 more than the 5060 and over $100 more than its 8GB brethren, the 9060 XT 8GB. So our recommendation in this video, if you have $200 US to spend, roughly, the RTX 3070 is definitely a consideration if you're willing to go on the used market. If you can't stretch your budget more than $220 and you want a new graphics card, the B570 is really the option. If you're willing to step up to around $270, our recommendation is either the 9060 XT 8GB, assuming you do stay in the 8GB VRAM buffer, you will not see any issues, as long as the performance with the 9060 XT will be pretty much similar to what we found with the 16GB version. The 5060, again, at $300 US, sometimes you can see it on sale for under that. The only thing I see with it right now, currently, if you are watching it at time of filming, is it does not come with the Borderlands 4 bundle. The RTX cards 5070 and above do offer the bundle, whereas the Intel Arc cards currently offer Battlefield 6 with any purchase of participating Intel Arc B580s, Intel Arc B570s, Intel Arc A770s, and certain processors, helping their current day value become more appealing. Now, if you're not going to buy Battlefield 6, maybe skip the Intel Arc series. Unless you're just looking for the cheapest good value graphics cards, the Intel Arc B580 and B570 at their MSRP is still a very compelling product. Over their MSRPs, they do become less appealing, as do most of the cards in the current market. However, currently at MSRP, if you compare MSRP to MSRPs, one of the better value products this generation has been the 5060. Now, the RTX 5060 is in dire need of a super series. It does need a super refresh. It needs at least 12GB of VRAM, and it would be a killer card. It would be probably the best card. It would be the card that everybody called the console killer if it stayed around at $300 MSRP. So there you have it. That's kind of our recommendations. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Comment down below what you want to see in the future. And as always, see you all in the next one.